Hello and welcome. As you would have seen in the update which I posted, this is looking at the problems that we're looking at, and we're looking at climate change, we're looking at COVID, and now geopolitical crisis in our neighborhood in Afghanistan. I call them wicked problems, and it's a messy world. And so, just to understand what the perspectives are and look at it from a completely different standpoint, I have with me this evening and at other parts of the world at your time zones, I have with me Priya Singh, who is Associate Director at the institute called Asia and Global Affairs. And she's traveled extensively in the region, uh, being an expert in West Asia, but also in Asia across the whole space. She's going to bring us her perspective from a political scientist, from a regional perspective. And I've also got Pallavi. Pallavi is actually Dr. Pallavi Roy. She teaches international economics at the School of Asian Studies in the University of London, and she's been leading for the FCDO in UK various programs which look at anti-corruption, look at post-nationalism, post-modernism, economic changes, COVID, economy impact of COVID, and many such areas which are related. Her focus has been, interestingly, South Asia and Africa. And we're going to hear from her as well, because I think the two pieces that we really need to look at is given the unfolding scenarios that we see, what exactly is going to pan out? We're seeing a very rapidly changing scenario in our neighborhood. This has happened in other parts of the world, and maybe we can hear from both these eminent interlocutors. What would this change look like? So, over to you, Pallavi. What are the future scenarios that you're going to be looking at, given the kind of rapid changes which we are seeing, at least in terms of news flow, a huge load of complexity, volatility, ambiguity all around. Um, has this happened before, or are we going to call this once in a lifetime, unprecedented event?
Thanks, Jay. I mean, we've got an hour and we are discussing some of the most life-changing dynamics that we're seeing, whether it's in our generation, and I hope for the generations to come after us, this is the worst that it gets. But I cannot deny, I don't think any of us can deny that these are some of the most momentous changes that we're seeing. But pardon me while I put this on silent. All done. But I think I'll spend a couple of minutes on my take on why we are here, and you'll probably have to indulge the teacher in me. I haven't had students listening in for some time now, so this might be a good opportunity. But why are we where we are? And to me, I'm an institutional economist. That's pretty much my sort of home framework. I study how societies are organized, and we all know that for societies to develop, for societies to grow, how well we are organized has a huge role to play. And we saw this huge state of flux with the first two world wars at the turn of the 20th century, the First World War, the Second World War, and the end of the Second World War seemed to kind of provide an impetus for some kind of growth coming in from the ruins of extremely volatile, extremely complex geopolitics. We then seemed to settle down into some kind of potential for golden age of growth or redistribution. And a lot of us grew up, even in developing countries, a lot of us grew up looking at the West and now OECD, now developed countries, saying, well, it's possible there, it might be possible for us. And obviously, as the years have rolled on and the decades have rolled on, we've seen it, and our younger generation is seeing it, that actually hasn't panned out. A few have made it, most of us haven't. And even in the few that have made it, again, a very few seem to have cornered whatever gains that there might have been from this growth process that's happened. So while there has been growth, increasingly it's not equitable. It's been extremely inequitous. It's now become extremely violent because it's so inequitous. So I think we're also looking at, and people have said this, I'm not saying anything new, but I think whether it's climate change, how we deal with climate change, whether it's disillusionment among the youth, however that disillusionment might be projecting itself. It could be a movement that we understand. It could be a movement that we might not understand, but we are dealing with a lot of disillusionment among the younger generation. And to me, a lot of that is because this Western model of capitalism, some models of democracy haven't really delivered what it was promised to deliver. So what does the future hold for us? We're not young. I wish we had some members of the younger generation talking to us, but I can see a lot of disillusionment. Youngsters they might be out on the roads, but they don't want to take part in politics because they say, well, we're only sort of electing 70-year-olds into politics. Even, I live and work in the UK, and we have one of the youngest prime ministers. From David Cameron onwards, prime ministers have been getting younger, but the youth still feel that they're not being represented. Forget a 70-year-old, even a 50-year-old is too old. So they will be out there protesting, but they might not be voting. We need to get them on board to vote. From this, there might be some kind of resilience that develops, which can only be good for us. But I'm also concerned that it could move to another trajectory, which is anger. And the last thing we need is an intergenerational war. And I can already see it happen. It's not that we are Luddites who don't do gaming, but it's in how we look at climate change. You're not being urgent enough. Is what we've heard so often. So I think it could be three of these trajectories. We'll have to see which one it is. Priya, I don't know what you think.
Hi, Pallavi. That made my job much more easy, I think, because you've just laid the groundwork. While I think it was last week or something, and we were having this conversation, Jay and me, and, how to kind of, go about this. When you look at the intertwining bit, we are talking about climate change, we're talking about, geopolitical crisis in the context of a global pandemic. What I see as an aberration, which probably needs to be kind of, read and analyzed, is the global word, in the sense that you do have epidemics, happening in the lesser privileged spaces almost, on a daily kind of a basis. And we don't really talk about it. We've never really analyzed it because of, the reach has been limited. It's because, it's been at an arm's distance as far as the global north definitely is concerned. So we are talking about the global penetration of an epidemic for pandemic, which kind of has intruded the more privileged spaces. Now, as far as the geopolitical crisis is concerned, it was Syria some time back. It's Afghanistan now. So these are fissures which just get accentuated from time to time. And about climate change, as you rightly pointed out, is something again which has been a constant for quite a while. So this intertwining, of these three aspects and its kind of impact on themselves as well as on other factors is something that really needs to be read. Now, as far as you've talked about society, and how the kind of disillusionment, but let me frame it, since you've covered that, let me frame it in a different sense. What we are seeing today, and probably what needs to be analyzed, is how the units, of say interpretation, analysis, have kind of changed, or need to be changed rather, in the sense that when we talk about geopolitics, as there has been a sort of ever growing literature on the kind of domestication of geopolitics. Now, this domestication goes further because home becomes a very important category. And this blurring of private and public is something which has got accentuated. Again, spatial differences, virtual and physical space, the geographies, how virtual geography again has become very important. So when you're situating societies, despite, albeit I agree, the limitations of the virtual space, but then again, you need to, again, the frame of reference has to be a little different because you're looking at the virtual world as well. That's something, again, we need to kind of, work on and see how that plays on.
I think
And
that's a very valid point you just made, Priya, and that blurring of physical and virtual spaces. Yeah,
you
please.
know, and no, no, no. And when we talk about home, I also bring in the gender category. I mean, for the longest period of time, writers who write on gender or gender specialists, for want of a better term right now, and who've looked at geopolitics have always talked about this lacuna of how the home gets neglected, which has been further accentuated now because we are all working from home. It's this intertwining is, I think, deeper. It's got as deep as it can be, and this binary has to go. Now, the important thing is, what about civil society, where we've been constantly talking about this shrinking of space? But when you talk about shrinking of space, there's been shrinking of space for certain civil society groups. Whereas, on the other hand, the state, for want of, probably a better system at place, has been happy to accept certain other civil society groups, like the health organizations, a number of voluntary health groups. Now, they could be having a particular ideology. They could be, they were probably formed around a particular ideology, constituted around a particular ideology or a particular religion. But as long as they serve their purpose of, catering to a large section, because our health structure is not in place, and this entire, space that we are talking about suffers from the same, same set of issues, problems. So there again, when you're talking about shrinking of civil society, I think that's a huge generalization. Maybe protests were not welcome, but then there were other ways of articulating resistance, which probably the state just couldn't neglect because of the sheer scale of the pandemic. So I think this generalization of shrinking of space of civil society is something that I wouldn't like to kind of accept wholeheartedly. So there have been silver linings. Every cloud has a silver lining, and I would say that. On the other hand, when we now study Taliban, which really needs to be kind of read from different ways, as we were kind of mentioning yesterday, there is no degree of homogeneity when we talk about any groups, and the same goes for Taliban. But one thing that becomes very important is, and I'll stop here, is when we are reading societies and civil society groups in the context of, say, an organization like the Taliban or Talibans. I mean, where would you place civil society groups based on gender, and how would you reorient education or inculcation of knowledge with with this kind of a background? And I'll stop here.
I think you made very persuasive points, Priya. What I take away is that the space for civil society is not singular, and the space for protest is also not singular. So this binary piece, which we tend to keep in our mind, is possibly confusing. And then I want to segue back into the thought process which Pallavi was rolling out, and I know she's been she's not been in front of her student audiences for what, 18 months now, operating from remote locations. So just one more point, Pallavi. Uh, you've seen the scenario, and you've seen different kind of scenarios, especially from the economic lens. What are the triggers from the economic lens point of view? Because you've seen certain similar things you were saying out of Nigeria, out of Africa. And have you seen any, way forward? Because we're talking about future scenario building, and you're bang on right saying that, what we are saying at this point of time is actually of greater use to the youth. So, what are the lessons, or rather the indications that you've seen there?
Again, excellent question. And I'll just hark back to, some of the points that Priya also made in reference to my answer. There is a space that there seems to be a global voice of the youth, but we also need to understand, and I think there is an increasing understanding that while there is a global voice and there's a global context, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's climate change, there is also a very local rootedness to the protests that are taking place. I am part of a global movement, but what you need to hang on, you need to understand that I'm also rooted in my cultural complexity, and it's always a cultural complex. And I don't mean this in any kind of, condescension. It's an understanding of the structure that I am part of. Culture is essentially, a structure of you can say it's basically power structures that surround me, and I respond to those power structures, and that becomes culture. It's like a repeated game, as we'd say in economics. But to simplify it, it's really like a repeated sets of behavior responding to a certain set of power structures, and that becomes my culture. And everybody looks at it from outside and then gives a sort of very loaded judgment on it. So in Nigeria, for instance, in South Africa, what we are looking at now, Nigeria had a uh, very sort of interesting but very unfortunate for the country set of protests in October 2020 against police brutality. Now, this police force was, it's interesting, this police force was constituted when Nigeria was still a military regime to look into violent crimes. This was about protecting society. This was organizing the police force to protect society and to protect the vulnerable. But the vulnerable had now become a target of this police force. I forget the name, Special Armed Robbery Squad. I think that's what it's called. My apologies to my Nigerian friends if I haven't got that right, but it's SARS. And it was, a
Okay,
whole
you
thing.
can you can stay at the surface. I mean, we don't possibly need to do
Right.
names. Yeah.
So it's SARS, and whole of it wasn't just the Twitter sphere. This is where the two actually came together. There was a hashtag EndSARS, but there was also spontaneous protest across Nigeria, certainly in its largest city, the commercial capital Lagos, where young protesters came on the road, occupied. There was a police firing. There's a lot of controversy around the police firing. How justified was it? How many lives were lost? Suffice to say that it was violent. It didn't end well. And this was in southern Nigeria, where the youth were calling for an end to police forces, much like in the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. In that sense, it was mirroring that. But within the same country in northern Nigeria, you actually had another sort of segue of youngsters who are saying, but hang on, northern Nigeria is facing another set of insurgencies, banditry. It's not just Boko Haram. There's more to the complexity of Nigeria than Boko Haram. And again, it's to the point that Priya was making. There is not one Taliban. It's fragmented. So let's not monolithize it. And these students, these youth were actually saying, we need the police. We need security. You can't just disband the police. Where do we go from there? So even within countries, you have this local, regional, and then global. You were taking inspiration from Black Lives Matter, but you also had a very, very local context over there. So I think that's one thing that I would really like to stress. South Africa, again, we saw what happened when one of the earlier presidents was jailed for contempt of court. The country just exploded. And a lot of it was simply due to the fact that the youth in the country don't have any employment options, any economic opportunities. So in that sense, we tend to miss the Africa story, but it is very similar to what is going on in the rest of the world. It's just manifested very, very, very differently. The youth in the Taliban, for whatever reasons, are protesting in one way. We most of us would not agree with it, but I think what this calls for is level of empathy. Why has it rolled down that particular trajectory? I think empathy is something that we really need to kind of factor in when we are looking at our frameworks. The youth in Nigeria have a very different kind of framework, but they're actually looking for the same kind of thing. Some things failed to deliver to them, and that's why they're out.
So that's fascinating, and I'd like to take that up in terms of when you say empathy in a framework. Priya, you've been to Afghanistan a couple of times, and you were mentioning in terms of the complexity of tribal loyalties, and you said that there is not one Afghanistan. It's a multicultural universe over there. When you look at it from that point of view, and when you look at what Pallavi is also saying, and you also stressed upon the disappearing of local and global borders, the merging of physical and virtual worlds, and this COVID focused local activation and expression of local disenchantment, some of it which we saw in Australia and Melbourne. Um, how do you see this pan out? Because if local is more important than global, and that's exactly what's coming out, we're seeing terrifying pictures of unfolding humanitarian crises in that region. How do you see the local replacing the global? And what kind of
I
lessons is global going to take out of that from your cultural context that you've seen over there? Yeah.
I don't think it's a competition between the local and the global. I don't think the local will replace the global or the global will replace the global. Now, if you have something like, say, what's happening at the moment in Afghanistan, one of the immediate global repercussions would be in the form of refugees, like it happened in Syria. So, you just cannot, draw that distinction that, there's going to be a upsurge of local and therefore, the global aspect gets sidelined. No, the issues at stake, are mostly existential issues. Now, one of the reasons, there is a school of thought, whether it is the Taliban or you say, you could refer to groups like the Hamas and even to, organizations like the Islamic State, every other, radical element that has, become popular and has kind of has been able to kind of come to power. There has to be some reason behind it, and I think some of the most important factors behind that are local issues, your everyday existential issues, problems of corruption. I mean, as she talked about Nigeria, I mean, one of the biggest problems which Afghanistan faced was, the elite nature of the ruling class. And, the fact that whatever, I believe a sizable amount of funds were being, placed at their disposal, but it was not triggering. It was just not penetrating down to the grassroots level. So one of the reasons why you have groups like the Taliban
Priya, your video's gone on pause, but cut in mid-sentence.
Yeah.
So, but
Oops.
while we wait for her to come back, why don't you just
yeah,
bring
I
us?
think
Oh,
there was
yes,
a
yes,
bit
she's
of a
back.
problem with
She's
my,
back.
Yeah.
yeah.
So your fervor got captured, but that's a very interesting alignment that you're building between splinter groups, what you've seen in West Asia, as well as what's unfolding in
The other
our
thing that
neighborhood.
I want to bring in, and I love to talk, so I'm going to kind of, butt in and talk, is that, the aspect of a certain ideology and the religious factor becomes important because these are organized groups which actually provide social service. So, the reason why there is some kind of a legitimacy to their, rise. And as Pallavi rightly mentioned, the empathy factor becomes very important. So when you talk about, as I said right at the beginning, this entire binary, local, global, no, there's going to be a lot of intertwining. And how the local, has the biggest example of, the local becoming global are actually radical outfits, how they transgress borders very easily. And they don't even need to transgress borders. It's the ideologies which transgress borders. The
So
ISI is.
I'm going to hold you on this. I'm going to hold you on this. Can you elaborate to any degree, because I know you have friends in Afghanistan? What is the role that connectivity, by better connectivity, social media, what's the role that has played both on either side? Has it? I mean, I know at one level you have worked on gender rights and educating the girl child. Has it also empowered the as some generals said, country boys with a code of honor? Have that also happened? Has social media or the digital piece
Social media,
worked
I
in
mean,
that?
obviously, I mean, starting from, say, when we talk about the entire extended region, I'll start off with the Arab Spring, 2010,
Hmm.
2011, it did play an important role. So even in, spaces like, that's an extended part of West Asia. We call it West Asia here, not the Middle East, it's the Middle East and North Africa. So yes, social media absolutely did play an important role, but in pockets, Jay. I wouldn't say it has the kind of reach, that
Hmm. Hmm.
probably you would see in, spaces of the global north. there are limitations. There are prohibitions, number one, where it's prohibited, and secondly, there are also monetary considerations, which is the case in India also, and other limitations as well. You could have we were doing a study on gender and digitization. That's in India actually. And
Right.
I think wherever there are patriarchal spaces, you will find a gender divide as well, where the influence of the social media is gets limited across gender lines as well. But then yes, of course, you have a lot of uh, say the leaders, the voices of women's movements, who've actually who came and studied in India, and then who've gone back. And there was a piece on the Telegraph today about a particular uh, a particular person who's been kind of taking the resistance forward against the Taliban, and who was in Delhi for a considerable period of time. So yes, of course, it is there, but there are limitations, like there are limitations in each of these spaces that I've referred to, be it South Asia, be it West Asia, and I'm sure in Africa as well. Pallavi could kind of testify to that.
Yeah, and Pallavi, just you mentioned a very very specific uprising and a very specific activation. At this point of time, our people are, multilateral agencies, the kind of organizations that you consult with, are they looking at frameworks? Because I think one of the things which has happened, and I think which has shocked a lot of people, is those pictures of, usually you see that if there's resistance, if there's an opposition, armed opposition, the conventional way has been to bring them onto the table, negotiations table, right? And this is possibly the first time in that I remember that they came onto the table, but took the table and the palace with it. Uh, the negotiations were somewhere else. So to that extent, I thought it was really strange, because you generally look at bringing people onto the big tent, but here the tent has been taken over. Um, are there other ways of, are there frameworks of putting some kind of a system in place? And why I'm asking is because, any extreme reaction has another counter reaction, and you're seeing polarized view. So if the if the population is not interested in getting polarized, but is interested in getting on with their life, are there such examples elsewhere that you have come across? um, you know, Post escalation, how does the de-escalation happen?
Again, I mean, we have a fairly successful example in our neighboring country, Nepal, which saw a very bloody civil war. Now, of course, in the context of civil wars, it's in the sense of the numbers, it might not add up to as much, but in terms of what it meant for Nepalese society and polity, it was absolutely, earth-shaking and once in a lifetime. You did have the Maoist uprising in all the neighboring countries. The large neighboring countries were involved. And today, Nepal is at a very interesting juncture. I know some of my Nepali friends actually say, no, but we just, it's all the same, and the same elites are back in power. And you could forgive them for saying that, but if you're an outsider, which a lot of us, outside in perspective, which when we do research that tends to happen, there's a lot that's changed. They have a new federal constitution. They are a secular country. They are actually beginning to talk about issues like caste in a way that I haven't seen being talked about in India. And let's not forget, the whole Madhes movement is to do with caste, is to do with identity, looking across the border. And the whole caste system is as entrenched in Nepal as it is in India. But there is dialogue, it's out in the open. So a lot of it is about dialogue. A lot of it is about making changes to the formal structure. So yes, the constitution is the formal structure, and that has changed, but it also has to go with an understanding that the formal might not mirror the real. And I think where development agencies and multilateral agencies can really do developing countries a favor is to not have this canonical belief in everything has to be the rule of law, everything has to be good governance. It's something that we've seen Africa suffer a lot with. Structural adjustment programs, poverty reduction strategy papers, this whole idea that you first have strong, uncontested property rights, and then growth can take care of itself. And that actually takes the entire historical turns, the historical trajectory of growth on its head. The UK developed on the back of some extremely violent social movements like the enclosures. The US had its own Gilded Age, which was, rife with corruption. You really don't have an example where rule of law developed in a very sort of orderly, sweet manner, and then we suddenly, decided to grow. It doesn't happen. You first have to grow to a certain level of per capita income, which might not always follow the rule of law. So to come back to Nepal, the idea that yes, there is a formal constitution, and we have the normative benchmark, it's extremely important. They have, they don't call it hierarchies, it's spheres of government. So there's Kathmandu, there's the provincial capitals, the 7 provinces, and there are about 744 local governments. You could argue that's too many for a country which is 27 million people. That's completely different. But they're talking in the sense of spheres of a certain equality in the give and take between government relations. So while and the reality can be very, very different across the different provinces and across the different palikas, but there is slowly an understanding that we have to understand this reality while we have to aim for the normative formal benchmark. And I think that's the framework which to my mind becomes very, very important, that we have to develop productivity. We have to develop productivity in a way that's redistributed, because one of the biggest problems that we have is inequality. I mean, people can say that, oh, the economists say that there's this hegemonic tribe across the world. But genuinely, if you look at how societies are structured, societies are extremely unequal. And unfortunately, because of how we are, there is a path dependency here. Because of how we are, you have to find economic as well as social solutions to it, but you can't divorce the economic. So to me, the framework is understanding that there are informal mechanisms, having the formal benchmark, but to work with the realities of that informal. Then, if that were really the case, we really wouldn't have been looking at an Iraq. We wouldn't have been looking at the failed state of Afghanistan. The West just refused to accept the reality of a unit like the Taliban or an ideology. It's there. You talked about the Taliban taking away the table and the castle, but before 9/11, there were aid agencies who just refused to deal with the Taliban when the Taliban were at that point ready to make a deal. They were saying, you give us the money, we'll build the schools, we'll listen to you, but we'll do it. Now, some of us might not agree with it, but it wasn't an open and shut case. But today, when the Americans are so desperate to get out, they wouldn't mind if the Taliban walked away with the castle, in a sense. I'm simplifying a lot of things over there, but that's how it is. It was in the American interest to let them walk away with it. It's not just that also invested that power in them to walk away. But there was a time when they were open to come and talk at that table. That's what I mean by understanding the informal and not always shoehorning the formal concept of rule of law and good governance. I think I'm rambling, but that's essentially where I am, that there is a dichotomy between the formal and informal, and we need to understand the informal.
I'm going to take this quickly across to Priya, because she's spent time in the society. She speaks the languages. Rule of law is also to do with behaviors, certain acceptable behaviors, certain accepted codes. You've seen that in West Asia, right? Um, how does what Pallavi say resonate with you? Do you see that in terms of, how does the codification happen? Because what I'm hearing from Pallavi is that there is one way or the highway. So if it's not, the way it's been understood to be in the post-World War II scenario of growth and development, it doesn't fit into the paradigm. So it's been one size fits all kind of a paradigm. Have you seen that flexibility, Priya? Where people have listened into society, we figured out that, okay, the social groups are different. This is the way to work with them, and then bring them onto the big stage and say that, okay, this is how we will share power. Have you seen that?
See, for the longest period of time, the spaces that, I have actually worked on have been spaces under, severe authoritarian, rule. I mean, it used to be called, a space of authoritarian resilience. I mean, till we had the, Arab uprisings. But then, they've always been these, and in fact, I want to harp on what Pallavi was talking about, the informal structures and how they are very important for, the negotiating partners, be it, an outside multilateral agency or agencies, or, the government in place. Now, on the surface, if you look at the West Asian space, again, for, want of time and the fact that we are kind of, limited in terms of that, is I'm using the entire space. Even though you have authoritarian, regimes and structures in place which look pretty entrenched and rigid, there has always been a degree of, flexibility. Otherwise, it would be impossible to operate. And the fact that though the global kind of focus came only on December 2010 and January 2011, when a series of incidents happened and we called it the Arab uprisings. But much before that, there were informal mechanisms of articulation of resistance which were constantly going on. Otherwise, you cannot have this one episode and you have a flare up. That's just not possible.
Right.
So I'm using it from the other context and saying that this has always been there. And even today, when we talk about, the failure of the uprisings, some kind of resistance, some kind of, informal understanding, informal kind of outreach is still there. So you have pockets of, otherwise it would be very difficult for any agency, any government to operate the way it has operated in most of the societies in the Middle East and North Africa. And where it hasn't, where you've had an international, sort of what would you say, penetration, like say Iraq, or you're talking about Syria, or you're talking about Afghanistan, things haven't really worked out the way it was planned. So, as she said, these informal spaces, be it, protest or the lack of it, everywhere there has been some kind of an informal understanding between the people at the grassroots level and at every level of power hierarchy. So that has always been there, and there have been adjustments, and therefore the codifications that you talk about, they don't really remain as stringent and as rigid as one would think, if you're looking at it from a generalized perspective. So local nuances are there. You have provinces, districts, everywhere, which has its own nuances, and they have been incorporated in what in India would have been called the Jugaad mechanism. It's there everywhere. It's an extended space. If I've made myself clear, that's how I look at it.
Now, I'm going to pitch a different side of the argument to Pallavi. I believe that a lot of the deal-making space, whether it's in social norms and the rule of law, comes out of economic benefit. You won't go and do something without something in it for you, because there's that question: what's in it for me? Sure, I'm going and doing a protest. I'm going and throwing a stone. There has to be something. There's some gratification in it for me. How do you see that pan out? And what are the incentives and counter incentives? Have you seen them work in the ground level?
So I'm going to take it at two levels. One is at a purely sort of materialist level of economic costs and benefits, and certainly when you're talking about say public sector reform. I'm just taking a case in point. Obviously, you have to look at the underlying incentive structures, political incentive structures, economic incentive structures, winners and losers, and there is a certain there is in literature a lot of work on working, what they call working with the grain, which is let's work with the powerful people. While that can work, that can also entrench status quo. It might not always be that just because the powerful people can push through reform means it's in their incentive to push through reform, let's say. So you need to then look at other potentially productive people, not necessarily powerful in terms of political power, but a productive base of capitalists who can change things around in a sector. What are their incentives? Can they be made to follow rules which they will implement in their own interest? I mean, I will implement a rule because I'm interested in implementing it. If I'm not, there might be a policeman looking at me spitting, and if he's there, I will not spit. If he turns his back, I'll spit. because I just feel, there's too much pound in my mouth, or however it is. But unless I feel that by spitting I'm doing some harm to myself, there's no chance. I'm really simplifying, but the whole point of rule following is it in my interest? Now that's not easy
Right.
for developing countries. How do you find these interests? So at a very micro level, that's the kind of work we do. But at the larger level, you talked about throwing stones, and it's something that I've been trying to work with, is this whole idea of identity rents. Now it can work in majoritarian societies, it can work in societies where minorities are oppressed, but in every way, emphasizing and re-emphasizing my identity provides me with a certain kind of rent. I might not get anything material out of it, but the fact that I'm being recognized, or I'm forcing you to recognize me, more often the person throwing the stone has nothing else, or she, in a lot of cases these are she's, and there is that power. All that she can do is pick up the stone. Is I am forcing you to recognize me. You don't recognize me otherwise. And it's not always possible for the policeman at the other end to generate empathy, but for us it is possible to take that sort of more neutral stance. So it's an idea of identity rent, which is part of a cost benefit ratio. It's just not an economic sort of net present value cost benefit analysis that we are
No,
doing.
no.
So
There's a
identity is
perceived value
therefore,
there, right? Even
absolutely,
identity has
absolutely,
perceived value. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not all material. So we work at two
Correct.
levels. One is the material incentive. The other is the identity incentive of who am I as an individual, and how do I fit into how my society is organized and how your society is organized. So I think that's where we've seen it work. And in a lot of cases, certainly in Africa, which for all reasons of colonial accidents, it's a vast space which's been very arbitrarily. We talk about South Asia, which has been arbitrarily cut up, and you look at South Asia, and the whole colonial project has been even more tragic and more disastrous. And honestly, countries are doing a fantastic job of picking up what they were left with, but it's that colonial hangover and social re-engineering which makes managing both the material sense of incentive and the identity sense of incentive far more difficult, because the sort of the reactions and the interactions of the two are more complex than in the global north. So it's actually more difficult to kind of, and if you need to really work with it, you need to understand the two and unpack the two, if that makes any sense.
No, I think I hear you. I hear you. And I think to a great deal, if you look at what's happening across, and Priya also referred to it, there is identity itself is a incentive, and what you do with the identity, how do you cash in that badge, is where your economic benefit. I'm fairly certain this is currently playing out. But Priya, from your understanding of the Afghanistan and the regions around, do you see one of the key things which a lot of people argue against economic development is the rise of the individual and the disappearance of family or tribal structures. Do you see this current instance of what's happening some kind of a reimposition of tribal and family structures which were there traditionally and have somehow or the other been disincentivized in that dream for individual economic progress? Is there a story there on this?
Uh, you know, I actually think what's very important is both these trends, be it, the individual aspect, of capitalism, of, the fact that, the individual is at the center of focus, as well as, you're talking about tribal loyalties, they run parallel, I think. And the other thing is, it depends upon which space are you looking at. I don't think, take Afghanistan, for example. What happens in Kabul does not really happen in, areas which are away from the capital. So the time when I went to Kabul, I mean, it looked like a UN space to me. I mean, it just looked UN all over. I mean, it didn't even look like, this was Afghanistan. The moment you kind of move further down, you realize that, it's a different existence altogether. So when you're talking about, all these landscapes, again, as I said, for paucity of time, we cannot go into the, specifics of each different space, be it Afghanistan, be it, the larger West Asian space. What happens in the urban, areas and the semi-urban areas particularly the areas where, funding, you have access to funding, is different from what happens in the interiors. So, the tribal, why do you think saying that, Kabul has been, freed of the Taliban, whereas the rest of Afghanistan never was? That is what I'm trying to say. So, these things run in parallel. And when you're talking about, predominantly rural, semi-rural, inaccessible spaces where the international agencies and, the powers to be, as well as, the governments which were installed, have actually no access, this very notion of individuality, I think, never really penetrated. I think we are looking at different spaces. I mean, that is where I think one really needs to penetrate and read. We haven't done enough of that as far as the Taliban is concerned, or the multiple Talibans are concerned.
Great, fantastic insights. Pallavi, what do you think is the way ahead, and what kind of, I wouldn't say scenarios, but what it's all talking about flexibility, adaptability with the kind of refugees um, movement that you're going to be seeing, and of course some kind of resilience. But are you thinking in terms of a reimagined future? Because you started off by saying post World War II, Bretton Woods kind of a play, and where are we now that we are looking at this kind of an outcome post COVID? Climate change is a big one, and now this geopolitical outcomes. How do you look at these outcomes so that they are more inclusive, maybe more diverse than they've been?
Whew. I mean, I wish we all had these little magic wands which we could wave.
No, no. I'll even say that, why don't you go into anecdotes and tell us some of your experiences, maybe your student experiences, which sort of give a hint that okay, there are these kind of outcomes which are possible.
At the individual level, there will always be positives. I think the problem or the constraint is in translating that success at the individual level, and kind of escalating that up and making this at a more societal level. So at the individual level, I have never failed to find those kind of positive stories in my students. And where I teach SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, we no longer say the full form, we just say SOAS University of London. About 50 to 60% of our students are international students. They come from Africa, they come from MENA, they come from South Asia, they come from East Asia. So, I mean, genuinely, my first experience of walking into class as a student there was I met somebody from Delhi, and I said, "Oh, you're from Delhi?" And she said, "No, Delhi, East Timor." I'm like, "Yeah, right, okay." And East
Yeah,
Timor had
yeah,
just come into existence, then it was just a year old. This is way back in
yeah.
2005 or 2006 when I was a postgrad student there. And it at one level, I know people hate the term globalization and sort of coming together, but I genuinely see hope in these kinds of student spaces. If the pandemic has shown one thing, maybe we can craft virtual spaces for youngsters, which actually it's easier to bring them together and share their experiences. There's of course there's nothing like the chemistry of so many students sitting together in the classroom and sharing their life experiences. But I think if there is one takeout, with the caveat that digitalization and access is a problem across many countries, I think we should still, with whatever we have in countries, whether in South Asia or Africa, have made strides. We need to do more in terms of connectivity, but using this as an opportunity to get more of them to talk to each other. However jaded this sounds, there is absolutely no alternative to getting people to talk to each other and listen to each other. I think that's Priya made a very important point. We haven't listened to these live stories. It's that I think so trying to use the virtual platform more and more to get people together in meaningful ways, not just to tick boxes. And we can talk about more about that, but I know we're running out of time. The other point that I would like to make is in the context of the pandemic. Suddenly, and this is something that Priya also referred to, suddenly the Western world has woken up to something that's pernicious, that is exactly like it happens in developing countries. You go out, you breathe, and you fall ill, and you fall ridiculously, disastrously ill, and it's not something which happens in your spaces. It's not supposed to. That happens in Nigeria with Lassa fever. Now, Lassa fever is something that actually has a lot of mortality across West Asia. Just not enough work has been done on it. But increasingly, I'm seeing as a result of the pandemic, whether it's malaria, whether it's Lassa fever, these kinds of sort of epidemics which earlier didn't gain a lot of traction and attention. People are now beginning to look at them, and it's important for public spaces to talk about these kinds of things in the Western world, because that's when you're going to get funds for R&D. So that, it's a blessing in disguise, if I may say so. More R&D going into these kinds of communicable diseases that actually we can keep talking about. And non-communicable diseases are taking lots of lives, but communicable diseases aren't going away. They're actually going to become intensify. So that pandemic has shown us that it's possible, and it's created a space for more work going into these kinds of things. So I think those two are future scenarios that I would take away as positives. There are the obvious negatives, and I'm not going to spend any time talking about the obvious negatives. I think we've got too much doom scrolling happening all the time.
Correct.
But I would take this away. Just get the youngsters together, and I think we in the older generation, possibly this comes across as somebody who spent a lot of time in classrooms, and Priya also definitely has, is they are looking out to us for some kind of guidance. I'm not sure whether we are able to give it to them properly, but I think the best that we can do is also to facilitate discussions among them, acting as interlocutors and not talking about, I know best because I'm your senior, mate, but not quite that. But you guys know, you guys have life stories to share. Let's talk about it. I mean, I've had Israeli students in class sitting next to Palestinian students. That is an extremely painful interaction to see. But it is an interaction that's possible. Like I said, it's possible at that individual level. Then when you go off and go into your own milieux, it's a different story. But if you start replicating that, I might sound like I'm coming from La La Land, but that is still one way of getting things on track while we try and do the big ticket geopolitical things. I don't know what Priya has to say about that, but I'm going to end here.
Priya, over to you. Individual contacts. Okay, 20 years of, I mean, you mentioned UN City Kabul. I'm sure they would have tried stuff like that there. I'm sure these thoughts are around. Where does it break down, and how does it come together? I mean, I know we're living through a breakdown right now. I think even Russia is evacuating its people and cutting down its embassy.
I guess the good thing is hopefully it can't get worse. Afghanistan, as an example, has been through this multiple times. And as Pallavi said, at the end of the day, it is only, the fact that people need to talk to each other, and particularly, the younger generation. There has to be more focus on what is called civil society. This entire belt, we were talking about 2019, starting from 2019, just before the pandemic, has seen extensive protests for extremely existential issues. So this culture of protest is not alien, and this is something that needs to be accommodated. There has to be a certain kind of way to go about it, maybe a framework. But as she said, the at the be all and end all is conversations. There has to be conversation. There has to be conversations cutting across different identities that we have. That is very important. These intertwining of multiple identities is so important. And yes, it's just as simple as that. Conversations, facilitating conversations, and for heaven's sake, not trying to impose something from outside. It's just not working.
Couldn't agree more, Priya.
So that sort of is like a wrap. Of course, in the times of social media and trolling, you don't hear conversations. You just hear takedowns and some views, and more takedowns and views. But I get what you're saying and where you're coming from. I'm hoping that. Okay, I'll just throw it around. Any last words before we close the session? Pallavi, any last thoughts, concluding remarks?
I think I'll go back to where we started, where I started rather. I think we're in a state of flux right now. There was a sort of we all, most of the three of us certainly grew up in the sort of comforting shadow of mutually assured destruction. That never happened, but we knew there was a certainty to it.
Yeah.
Misha flying off, that was our Sputnik publishers. That was what we grew up with. Then suddenly the Berlin Wall came down, things changed, and we were all settling down to a sort of unipolar world. And it had settled into a certain kind of rhythm. But as Priya said, there was so much imposition from the outside. This unipolar world began to crack. The imposition was just too much. What we are now seeing is a state of flux, and then this is disequilibrium of
Right.
the sort of most perfect kind. And as we see an adjustment towards another kind of equilibrium, and we really don't know, all bets are off, we are going to see a lot more flux and a lot more complexity. So there will be a lot more pessimism, but I think it's up to us, certainly also in terms of climate change, to come together. We didn't talk enough about climate change, for instance. But again, it's a really sad thing that things have to start
We'll
happening
plan
in the
another
West.
session on it.
Done. Berlin
Right, yeah.
floods, and suddenly COP26 becomes the big thing. But I genuinely think that we should expect a lot more flux. So therefore, we should prepare. Mitigation and adaptation becomes really big, more than anything else. And I'm not just talking about climate change. So I think these things have to be factored in. Policymakers no longer, especially, Afghanistan has certainly shown us, but so has climate change and the pandemic, that adaptation and mitigation have to be a big part of how we plan for the future, any kind of future scenario. It's not just that we plan for a future scenario. There has to be mitigation and adaptation, because we might not reach a particular good level of a future scenario. So this disequilibrium continues, but we just have to make sure that we keep the conversations going and try and understand. As I said, empathy for me is a really good framework.
Yep.
Yeah, would
Sounds
agree
good.
with that completely.
Priya, any
Yeah,
last
just
words? Yeah.
empathy is the word. The
Before we wind
only
up.
other
Yeah.
thing, since we are talking about, as academics, Pallavi, I think it's time we just gave up on these meta narratives that we, always talk about. It's so important. You started off with the global, that we actually look at the global as, as a very, very important starting point. I mean, local, I'm sorry. Look at the local as a very, very important starting point. And, these binaries, these watertight compartments have to go. And it's basically flexibility, adaptability conversations, as you said, at all levels, cutting across all levels. I guess that
Fantastic.
is,
Fantastic. So, I was really nervous when I started the session and thought of this session, because, we know the wicked problems, we know we are in a messy world, but I'm so happy that at least we've got one formula, or maybe three keywords to look at the future with, flexibility, adaptability, and conversation. Fantastic. It's been
those
a
are very
pleasure.
difficult things to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
No, but
It's
it's
been
been
a
a
pleasure.
pleasure.
I think I'm
Yes.
talking to
Absolutely.
both of you after ages. Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
a pleasure to be face to face with the two of you. Stay well, and
Yeah.
thank you all
Thank you
for
so
joining in.
much.
Thank
Thank you
Thank
for
you so
inviting
much.
us, Jay.
Yeah,
Bye, Priya.
stay well. Take care.
Take care,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.